Welcome to another guide. This time, we're looking at how to win lane. If you're a jungler, I'm sorry, this one's not really for you, although it's still good stuff to know for when you're off-rolling or filling in Clash. In this video, I'm going to be throwing a bunch of questions at you that you should think about, along with some advice. The better you can answer the questions, the better your understanding of laning will be. They are questions that you can return to over and over to keep improving your ability. If you think I've missed any important factors to consider, stick them in the comments below so that myself and everyone else can add them to our self-review sessions. Hey guys, it's Gimmers from the future here editing this video. I realised that winning lane is a big topic, and if I put everything into one video, this video is going to be like an hour long. So I'm going to break it down to smaller chunks. All the questions that you should try to answer when looking to win lane are in the description, broken down into the sections and videos they'll be in. I cover some of them in this video, but obviously not all of them. Anyway, back to old me. The first thing to do is make sure you understand the strengths and weaknesses of your champion. What is your champion good at? This can be determined by their kit, what their abilities do, what they scale off, what are the scalings like, and so on. At a very shallow level, these are the reasons why some champions are played as supports, some as tanks, some as DPS, and so on. You probably get that, but there are so many champions in League now that a lot of them blur the lines. They can do multiple things depending on the situation. For some very broad generalizations, you can think of champions with on-hit bonuses and soft CCs as being geared towards longer, more drawn-out fights. On the flip side, high damage abilities with long cooldowns and movement abilities can indicate that your champion is good for one-shot attempts. Lastly, hard CCs, lifesteal, and healing or shielding are all good for taking quick trades and still coming out ahead in the long run. Next, you'll want to make sure you know when your champion is powerful and when they are weak. This is the most important section. Generally speaking, if you're a higher level than your opponent, you're stronger. There are also groups you can stick champions into, which allow you to apply a sort of rule of thumb. You might be familiar with terms of early game, mid game, and late game champions, but do you know what they mean, and why those champions are categorized as such? If you do, feel free to skip forward, but if not, let me run you through it quickly. Early game champions are generally considered as being strong during the laning phase. This is because they tend to have abilities with low cooldowns and high base stats. They don't need to rely on their abilities being maxed or having a bunch of stats from items to get value out of their abilities. They also tend to have abilities that are really good at dealing with people who are right in front of them, and are effective in 1v1s or small skirmishes. Draven's a good example of this.
Welcome to the League of Draven.
As his Q gives him loads of relatively consistent damage at the start of the game, and his W gives him a significant buff to his movement speed and attack speed. This allows him to dish out way more damage than almost all of his competition. It's easy for him to deal with his opponents as their CCs, which prevent him from running them down, are on long cooldowns. This means that if they miss, he can collect his Dravens. However, as the game goes on, his comparatively shorter auto-attack range becomes a factor, with other champions able to poke him out. Especially because it's very telegraphed where he's going to move due to his Q, having to pick up his axes. Alternatively, the opposition support shield might become stronger, or their CC on a lower cooldown, allowing them to turn the tide after a certain point in the game. He will also have to deal with more threats from different directions, rather than just the opponents who are directly in front of him in the lane, who can mostly only react in a linear fashion, going backwards or forwards. Later on, these flanking opportunities become much more common, and Draven has little in the way of dealing with attacks from multiple fronts. This is a pretty simple breakdown of a champion. You should be able to do this much analysis of your own champions at minimum. Ideally, you should be able to break it down even further. Mid-game champions find success with 1 to 2 items and can excel in a number of scenarios. They tend to be better at dealing with multiple targets and wrestling over objectives, however they might also be good at fighting in choke points, allowing their team to get control of specific areas of the map. A lot of tanks fit into the description of a mid-game champion. Their relatively high base stats and damage hasn't normally fallen off by this point, and their itemization also enables them to wreak havoc. Being able to pick up resistance or health items makes them very hard to kill, and at this stage of the game, the enemy team's carries won't have penetration items or enough in terms of damage stats to utilize their high scalings. Consider Maokai,
The trees have learned violence,
who has a passive that heals a percentage of his HP, has relatively low cooldowns from the start of the game, high base damages, easy single target lockdown with his W, and an almost unmissable screen-wide hard CC in the form of his ultimate. No carry would be able to withstand a Maokai all-in at 1 to 2 items without assistance or some form of disengage, such as a dash or flash. Late game champions tend to be the opposite of early game champions. They have monstrously high scalings, so that when they get items they can outdamage the early game champions. They have abilities that have significant impact, which will have a much lower cooldown once they are maxed and they have items enabling them. They are also very strong in specific scenarios, such as ADCs that can provide very high DPS with the protection of their team, or side laners who become unstoppable in 1v1s. There's also niche champions like Blitzcrank who, one good hook later in the game can completely end the game, and he has many chances to do it with the low cooldown it's on. Some cooldown reliant mages that can melt whole teams also fit into this category, such as Kassadin.
Justice will be served.
His ultimate gets reduced to a 2-second cooldown at max rank, and as it allows him to flash with an 80% AP ratio, plus 360 base damage, plus 6% of his max mana as damage, it gets pretty nutty. A lot of the time, Kassadin is a ticking time bomb, where if he hits level 16 and you don't have a very specific comp that can deal with him, the champion become more or less unstoppable at that point in the game. Combos like Riftwalk flashing and Riftwalk Zhonya's into another Riftwalk offer little to no counterplay, and can deal huge damage to your entire team. Before he has access to this ability, Kassadin has little in the way of a defensive option though. He's also gated to be playing as a melee character, one that is incredibly susceptible to the early game AD characters. In the early stages of the game, his ultimate has a respectable cooldown, and he can only use it once or twice before it starts to become a significant mana sink for him too, so he has to use it sparingly until he gets enough stats. A lot of champions get a big power spike at a certain level. The obvious one is level 6, with many champions suddenly becoming considerably scarier. Malphite, Riven, Malzahar, and so on. You are really playing for that level 6 mark on any of these champions. There are other less obvious power spikes though. AD Sion, which is a personal favourite of mine, Sylas and Kassadin also enjoy significant power on their ultimates at level 16, achieving tantalisingly high damage, stats and low cooldowns, as we discussed earlier. It's not just ultimate abilities that are all the rage though, non-ultimate abilities can also give champions a lot of power too. At level 9, Vladimir should have all 5 levels in his Q, Transfusion. At this point, the cooldown is almost halved from where it starts, from 9 seconds to 5 seconds, and its base healing and damage are doubled. He will also be starting to get some serious cooldown reduction into his build, and some AP to make use of the high scaling. These changes make him almost unmovable in a 1v1, as coupled with his other abilities, he can sustain through most of the damage a single champion could throw at him. Naturally, his repeated healing also means he wins many battles of attrition. Scaling and power spikes are really important to consider, but they can be rendered irrelevant in certain situations. Consider the following champions at these points in the game. Set is very strong at level 1. At level 1, auto attacks proportionally contribute a lot more to your overall damage than later on, because your only means of dealing damage are your auto attacks and a single ability. Set's passive means he auto attacks more, and they do quite a lot of damage. He also has an auto attack reset when taking his Q, which deals even more damage, and gives him movement speed so you can't get away from him. Finally, the other part of his kit means that he gets a load of HP regen at lower HP, so it's really hard to kill him because most champions don't have any serious burst at level 1. Another champion that sort of fits this category is Trundle. Some more quick and easy examples of positioning and setup affecting the strength of a champion are Jax. If the opponent walks into range while his cooldowns are up, he can utilise his counter strike without having to commit his Q, allowing him to leap strike to disengage after a favourable trade. Yasuo, if he has a minion wave in front of him and is near his tower, he can close distances and chase you all the way through the wave with his sweeping blade, allowing him to trade on his terms, whilst also avoiding skill shots and getting his shield up faster. An edge case is Shaco, think of Pink Ward here. Having his boxes set up in the right place and baiting the enemy to walk into them can be devastating. Some champions are lucky enough to be scary right from the start of the game, but most need an item or a component item to really start to threaten the opposition. Again, there are different weightings to how these can affect a champion, but they should all be taken into account. Almost any lethality champion becomes dangerous or threatening once they have a serrated Dirk. Think of Zed. Most of the time, if the lane has gone how you want, you'll be getting that first recall at 1100 gold and picking up a Dirk. This is a pretty strong point for you in the game. You'll have a lot more damage against the enemy mid, jungle or bot lane. But if you think about it from the flip side though, if you're playing the opposing mid laner, then you might be able to also recall and pick up a Seeker's Arm Guard. It costs the same amount of gold. Now this thing gives loads of armor and counters the serrated Dirk. In this situation, they've actually gained more power relative to the matchup, at least if you think about it solely in items. Other component items that offer a lot for champions are the Tiamat, the Oblivion Orb, a BF Sword, Hextech Revolver, Balmy Cinder, Sheen, and a Cutlass. There are also very specific items that can have a big impact on some champions. Tear of the Goddess is a good example on Cassiopeia and Rise, allowing these champions to really amp up their pressure as they rely heavily on being able to spam their abilities. Normally at the start of their game, this is gated by their mana pool. Tear opens up the doors for them in this regard. Another example is Phage or even Tier 2 boots for Darius. In the top lane, Darius is pretty much unrivaled in a 1v1 if he can stick to his enemy laner. The speed bonuses from boots and Phage allow him to do this, especially if his opponent doesn't match him in speed items, they simply won't be able to get away. There are of course big spiking items too, but you should be able to recognize these without me pointing them out. Things like Trinity Force on a split pusher like Jax or an AD caster like Ezreal count here. When one of these champions gets these items, you know they're suddenly stronger. Sunfire Capers for tanks, Rabadons for mages, and so on. Most of the time these are core items or are built in certain games and can heavily influence the strength of a champion at a given time. Understanding this and utilizing this spike and power is very important. Once you get that Triforce, you need to start thinking about, can you fight someone? Now we're starting to get to the finer details. These are slightly less important than the big deal things, but they still matter. A lot. Like everything else, being good at League of Legends is made up of getting all of these tiny things down and acknowledging them. When you put them all together, they start to have a major effect on your ability to play the game and to win games. The first of these finer details is passive stacks. I mean, there are many different champions with passive stacks that can affect the opposition in a variety of ways. League started to get memed pretty heavily when every new champion seemed to have a 3-stack on-hit passive. Vayne and Gnar are obvious examples of that, with every third hit deals a percentage of the opponent's health as damage. If you're playing these champions, you want to try and make sure you're getting that third hit off where you can. Other important passives to look out for though are things like Annie stacking up a stun, Rengar getting his empowered ability. I mean, these kind of passives have become pretty easy to track and they're quite obvious to think about with the visual changes, so I won't linger on them. There are subtler things to watch out for though, and these are things like our Triforce buddy Jax and Ezreal. These guys get stacking attack speed from their passive. While it doesn't seem like a huge deal, once they start to get a few stacks behind them, it significantly affects their strength in any kind of fight. Jax can go toe to toe with a lot of top laners very early in the game if he can start the fight with 6 or so stacks, so if you just let him attack the minion wave for a little while and then fight him, it's a lot harder than if you just start fighting him before he gets a chance to get any of those stacks. Being aware of this and playing around it can drastically affect your experience as or against the champion. There are many seemingly minor details like this that can determine whether you win or lose lanes when playing different champions. It does take a certain level of mastery over the champions to use these things effectively in a lot of cases, and this is one of the reasons why it's recommended and I advocate to only play up to 3 champions in solo queue. Pretty much all keystones should be played around. When they were first introduced, I didn't really take them into account and just let them proc whenever they happened to proc. This is wrong. Runes can have a massive impact on your laning phase, and even later into the game. Actively trading on your keystone cooldown will increase your champion's strength significantly. Grasp should be procced pretty much whenever it's up, if you can. Try and get their auto in on the enemy when they go for a last hit. With Electrocute, make sure you're comboing the enemy when it's up, and not 3 seconds before. That's like 100 damage that you could be missing out on. Remember, you can use auto attacks to get Electrocute off too, especially if it's during some very early trades in the lane, like at level 1 or level 2. Conqueror and Lethal Tempo ramp up your ability to fight a lot as well, so when you've got them stacked or ready to go, look for a fight. It's like having an extra item over your opponent provided theirs isn't also active. The damage from these runes can make the difference between winning the fight or not. For supports, make sure your Guardian is ready for an all-in or prolonged trade, as it will negate a whole ability's worth of damage. You don't want it to be down because you were standing next to your AD carry when a random Ezreal Q came out 5 seconds before both junglers were about to enter your lane. Other niche runes like Glacial Augment and Phase Rush are taken on specific champions with specific goals in mind. Utilizing them for their intended purpose can get you kills you just wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. Now, minor runes also matter, like getting your mana flow stacked or getting the attack speed from Alacrity. Playing around these is really putting weight onto the details. I would suggest making sure you know exactly what all of your runes do and try to incorporate them into your play as best you can. Like I said, it's the small things that add up and make you a better player. So once you've done all of that, you should know when your champion's strong, what items make you strong, and what levels you're strong at. Now the next thing to do is use this to understand when you're weak. Obviously you can apply pretty much the same kind of analysis, so I won't go over it again, but knowing when you're weak is probably equally as important as knowing when you're strong, because when you are weak, you know you don't want to go for those fights. You want to wait it out, get to that point where you're strong again, and then start to look to take advantages. Now, after you found out when your champion is strong and when they're weak, it's time to start thinking about the enemy champions. The only thing that really matters in a lane is how strong you are relative to the other champion. So if you know when they're strong, then you can sort of weigh yourself against them in terms of strength and decide, okay, now I can beat them. Or, you know, if you're weaker, you can also say, hey, I need to hold out here, I need to wait for this certain point. Sometimes there's champions that you just will never beat depending on matchups, or perhaps they scale better than you and you've already let them get ahead, in which case you need to understand you can't fight them anymore in the lane and you have to try and make plays elsewhere on the map. So at the end of the day, the real skill for being able to use this info becomes apparent when you know your own champion and the enemy's champion, so that you can determine who is strong relative to the state of the lane. Of course, if the other guy knows less than you, sometimes it doesn't matter who is stronger. They won't play accordingly in certain situations, and you can capitalize on it. Also, the opposite is true. If you don't know as much as the other guy, it can feel like there's literally no options for yourself. And if you ever feel like this, it's probably because you're missing something. I'll go into this slightly later on in another video. Now that's all we're going to cover for now in this video. There are some more things I'm planning on covering in future videos, but I didn't want this one to be too long. I'll leave the questions for the next video up on screen now, and then I'll add my tips in the next video. So thanks for watching, guys. I know it's been a long while since the last video. I'm not going to promise when the next one comes out now, because I've not been very good at that, but I hope this one helps you too, and hope you're all having a good day.